Hey everyone, this is Devin with EdgeDB, and today I'm going to be taking you through a build of a simple blog application using Next.js and backed by EdgeDB. This build is based on a guide that is in our documentation. I will add a link to that in the video description below. You are seeing now a preview of what the finished build is going to look like. And let's flip over to a terminal and get started. Okay, I'm ready to kick off the project here in iTerm. First, I'm going to use the Create Next App CLI to bootstrap our application. We're calling this Next blog. You can call it anything you want, but that will just determine the name of the directory that the CLI will create for us. It's installing all the dependencies. And once that's done, we can change into the directory for our new application, which is next-blog. Let's start by bringing up a development server with yarn dev, just so we can see what this looks like. I've launched Chrome and gone to localhost port 3000 in the browser, and this is what I see. Welcome to Next.js. That tells us that the application was bootstrapped and the development server is working. So now we're ready to start building our blog app. Back over in my terminal, I'm going to give myself a new tab and then use the code CLI to open this project in Visual Studio Code. It's actually VS Codium, which is a fork of VS Code, but it's essentially the same thing. If you're using VS Code, you'll be able to follow along. We are going to start with our blog's homepage, and that's going to be in Pages at index.tsx. Now, just to give myself some more room, I'm going to collapse this Explorer sidebar, and we're ready to start making our own modifications. We don't need this image component because we're not going to have any images in this blog project. But what we do need is we need to bring in a type called nextPage, and that's from next. We're going to use that to type our homepage component. Now we need another type for our posts, and we're going to write that one from scratch. So type post. The post is going to have an ID, which is a string. It's going to have a title, which is also a string. And it's going to have content, also a string. I'm going to rework this function declaration a little bit so we can use our new type. So we'll declare a constant homepage of type nextPage, and we're going to assign that an arrow function. I'm going to grab everything that was returned out of that old function and return it from this one because that part will be mostly the same for us. Now that leaves me with an extra curly brace. We're going to export, and this will be our default export, the homepage component. Let's scroll back up to our homepage component, and we're going to create some posts. Ultimately, these are going to be stored in EdgeDB, but for now, to get started, we're just going to hard code them right into the component. So const posts, and this is an array of our post type that we created just earlier, equals. Now we are ready to write these post objects. They have to conform to that type we created earlier, so they need an ID. We'll just call this one post1. They need a title, and the first one will be this one weird trick makes using databases fun. The content of that post is just use EdgeDB. Now for our second post, the ID will be post2. The title, how to build a blog with EdgeDB and Next.js. The content of that one will be watch this video. Now we have some posts. Let's go down and start making modifications to the JSX this homepage component is returning. The title here should be my blog. And for the description, we're going to say an awesome blog. Okay, a lot of this stays the same. I will change this H1 to read just blog. Now, here's where we start to differ from the app that the CLI bootstrapped for us. So I'm just going to delete pretty much everything else because at this point, we're going to be putting in our blog posts and that's kind of it. I don't think I want this footer either, so I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, let's add a div with some inline styles. And that's just going to be a height of 50 pixels. Below that, we're going to start iterating through our posts. So posts.map. Name the parameter post. And from that, we want to return some JSX. We're going to start by wrapping all of this in a link. And we'll use a template string here so that we can easily use our post's ID. Next, we'll provide a key, which will also be the post ID. That way all of those are unique. Next, we're going to have a div with a class that's going to come from our CSS module, styles.card. And this is where we're going to put our post title inside this paragraph. Now I'm going to save that, and it should trigger a hot reload over in the browser. There we go, we have our blog homepage. It's great to be able to see that up and running, but nobody is going to want to pull up these files and manually edit posts inline inside a React component. We want our data to be stored somewhere outside of our code. So let's initialize an EdgeDB project. I'm assuming at this point that you have EdgeDB installed and set up. If you don't, there is a section in the written guide that covers that called Initializing EdgeDB. I'll put a link to that in the description. Once you do have EdgeDB installed and ready to go, we're going to start using the EdgeDB CLI. We're going to type EdgeDB project init. This is going to run through and interactively ask us a few questions. Do we want to initialize a new project? Yes, we do. Then we can specify the name of the project. The default is fine. That's going to be based on the directory name that we're currently in. Now we can specify the version of EdgeDB we want this project to run under, and the default is fine for this as well. Now the CLI is going to bring up a new instance and create a default database in that instance. Once you see this project initialized, you're ready to go. Just to confirm that everything is running, we can type EdgeDB, which will connect us to a database console. And now we are able to run queries against the database we just created. That's not super helpful right now since it doesn't have any data in it, but just to verify, we can select 2 + 2, and that gives us 4. Looks like we are connected and everything's working. I'm going to use Control-D to get out of this, and we can just dismiss this notification telling us in macOS Ventura that a background process has been added. Before we can do anything with this database, we're going to need a schema. Let's switch back to VS Code and create that right now. I'm going to pop the Explorer back out. I'll expand this DB schema directory and open default.esdl. We're going to create our schema right inside this default module. This will be a pretty simple schema since we only have one thing really that we want to store in the database, and that is blog posts. We'll define our blog post type with a required property that is title. That's going to be a string type. And another required property that is content. This will also be a string type, and it will have some additional options associated with it. Namely, we're going to give it a default value, and that will be just an empty string. One difference you may notice between this and the post type that we had created is that we don't have an ID property. We don't need an ID property because EdgeDB is going to handle that for us automatically. Let's save that schema, flip back over to a terminal. Now we have two steps before that schema is actually applied to the database. The first one is EdgeDB migration create. That creates our initial migration. Now to apply it, we'll use EdgeDB migrate. Now just to show you that, let's go back into the console and we'll do \ds for describe schema. And we should see something that looks remarkably similar to the schema we just wrote. Now that we have a schema in place, we can start to put some data into the database. So let's go back and add those two posts that are currently hard-coded into our component to our EdgeDB database. We'll also do that here in the console. We can do it using an insert. First, we need to give it the type we're inserting, which is blog post. Now we'll give it the title, which is this one. Weird trick makes using databases fun. And the content for that post is use EdgeDB. Now we'll close the curly braces, add a semicolon, and our blog post has been inserted. Let's go ahead and put the other one in. How to build a blog, EdgeDB, and Next.js. Watch this video. Okay, 2 blog posts in. Control D to get back out to our shell, and let's get these loaded up in the app. Before I can do that, I'll need to install the EdgeDB client, which I can do with npm install EdgeDB. Now let's go back to the editor, and inside my pages API directory, I want to create a new file that is going to be post.ts. Here we're going to create an API endpoint that lets us query the database and get those posts out. Let me collapse my sidebar so we have lots of room. And I'm going to start by bringing in a couple types. Next API request and next API response. Both of those are from Next. Then from EdgeDB, I want to import create client, which I'm going to use right here in my initial export, which we'll call client. And it'll just be a call to that function we imported, which will create a client pool we can use to query the database. Now I'm going to write a handler for this endpoint. Next.js will pass it 2 arguments. That's the request and a response object that we can use to deliver the response. Inside this handler, let's start by creating a constant posts. And we'll assign that the results of a query. We'll just write a EdgeQL string query right here as the argument to the client's query method. Select blog post. Now we want to define the fields that we want. We want the ID, we want the title, and we want the content. And we'll close that up with a semicolon. Now we can formulate our response to send that back to the API consumer. Let's save this file and flip back over to our browser to check it out. On localhost 3000, we will go to API post. And there we have in JSON our 2 blog posts that we just added. The next step will be to get these into our blog application's front end. To do that, we go back to the editor, flip back to our index.tsx, and we're going to bring in a couple of new things here. We need a couple of functions from React. We need useState and we need useEffect. Now we can go down here and get rid of these posts because we're now going to be pulling those out of the database. So let's initialize some state to hold these posts once we pull them out. We'll initialize that as null. And we've set the types so that this can either hold an array of posts or it can hold null. We'll use useEffect to actually fetch these from the database, or rather from the API endpoint, which is then getting them from the database. We'll pass useEffect an arrow function, and we will have it make a request to our new API endpoint. Once that's back, we'll call the JSON method on the results, and then we'll pass that result into our setter for the state we created. This useEffect has no dependencies. That way it will run once when the component is initialized, and that's it. And just to make this a little bit nicer experience for our users, if there aren't any posts, let's go ahead and return a loading message. So that will short circuit this component and just send back a paragraph with loading in it. If there are posts though, it'll go on through and return this big JSX component we created earlier. Let's save that and flip back over to the browser. Now we want to go back to the home page. If this works, which it apparently did, we should see exactly what we saw before, except now the data is sourced from the database instead of being hard-coded into the component. So it looks like we're in good shape. One thing I can also notice is if I hover over these, my status bar updates and shows the new UUIDs for the posts. So I am relatively sure this is coming out of the database and not just some sort of residual from what we did before when we hard-coded those values in. If I refresh this page for just a split second, you should see in the top left-hand corner that loading indicator. You can just barely see it there. So it looks like everything is working just as we intended. Thank you for joining me for that build. We have a cool blog up and running here, but we could take this one step further. One thing that EdgeDB offers through our client bindings is end-to-end type safety. But since we've written our queries as strings, we're not utilizing that the way we could here in this application. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to adapt this application to use our query builder so that you can take advantage of that type safety. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified when that video goes live. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon.